The horizon is black silk, no moon, no stars, just the hum of engines beneath the deck and the glow of radar screens casting green light across the faces of Japanese gunners. It's 2:47 a.m., October 1944, Western Pacific. The radar operator's hand freezes. Blips, dozens of them, moving south-southwest at 8 knots. A convoy, large, slow, vulnerable. Admiral Kurita leans over the screen. His jaw tightens. This is it, the supply line the Americans think is hidden. He raises his hand. All batteries, engage. The cruisers pivot, turrets swing toward the empty sea. And then, fire. The night explodes. Shell after shell screams into the darkness. Flashes paint the waves orange. The noise is deafening. For 3 hours they fire, hundreds of rounds, thousands of pounds of steel and explosive, arcing through the black, crashing into water. But there are no ships, no hulls splitting apart, no flames, no screams, just the ocean, swallowing metal, indifferent. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that they'd been lured into firing at ghosts, a phantom fleet, crafted by radio waves, buoys, and smoke, the most elegant trap of the Pacific War. If you love stories where deception rewrites the rules of war, hit subscribe, because what happens next changed naval warfare forever. To understand how an entire Japanese task force was fooled into wasting ammunition on shadows, you have to go back to 1944, a year when the war in the Pacific had turned into a brutal chess match of intelligence, deception, and industrial might. By mid-1944, Japan's naval dominance was crumbling. The battles of Midway and the Philippine Sea had gutted their carrier fleet. But Admiral Toyota Soemu, commander of the combined fleet, refused to surrender the seas without one final desperate counterstroke. His target, the American invasion of the Philippines. The plan was called Shogo, Victory Operation. It was Japan's last roll of the dice. The Americans knew it was coming. Intelligence intercepts, code-breaking efforts through Operation Magic, and reconnaissance painted a clear picture. Japan would throw everything it had left at Leyte Gulf. General Douglas MacArthur was returning to the Philippines, and the Japanese would try to destroy his beachhead before it could take root. But raw intelligence wasn't enough. The Allies needed an edge, a way to mislead, distract, and fracture Japanese coordination. Enter the Office of Strategic Services and Navy Intelligence Planners, who began crafting something unprecedented, a strategy where the enemy's own eyes and ears would betray them. The concept was called Operation Baitfish. It wasn't about firepower, it wasn't about ships. It was about belief, making the Japanese admirals see what wasn't there and believe it so completely that they'd commit resources, time, and position to a lie. The architects of Baitfish understood something profound about modern warfare. Radar had become the new battlefield vision. In the age of night operations and vast ocean expanses, commanders trusted their screens more than their eyes. A blip on radar was treated as gospel, and that trust could be weaponized. The plan required 3 elements working in perfect synchronization. First, radio deception. Allied signals teams would broadcast fake merchant traffic, distress calls, supply requests, chatter between non-existent escort ships. They'd mimic communication patterns down to the syntax and timing, creating an auditory illusion of a vulnerable convoy moving through contested waters. Second, radar reflectors. Small buoys equipped with corner reflectors, metal structures designed to bounce radar waves back with exaggerated intensity, would be scattered across a carefully plotted course. To Japanese radar operators, these would appear as hulls, large and metallic, moving in formation. Third, visual decoys. Patrol boats trailing smoke generators would create the haze and visual signature of a slow-moving fleet at night. From a distance, through darkness and rain, it would look real. Deception as architecture. Illusion as weapon. Meanwhile, we're operating under immense pressure and fragmentary information. Their reconnaissance capabilities had been degraded by months of attrition. Fuel shortages meant fewer scouting sorties. Communication between fleets was inconsistent, relying on radio transmissions that were vulnerable to jamming and interception. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the Center Force, the most powerful surface group Japan still possessed. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers and destroyers. His mission was to break through the Leyte beachhead and annihilate MacArthur's transports. But to do that, he needed to know where the American carriers were, where their supply lines ran, and where he could strike without being ambushed himself. That's where the trap tightened. Allied intelligence teams knew Kurita was nervous. They knew he was searching for targets. They knew his fleet burned precious fuel with every maneuver. So they gave him exactly what he was looking for: a convoy, undefended, moving through the night. Too tempting to ignore, too vulnerable to pass up. The fake radio traffic began on October 23rd. Merchant vessels reporting their position, a destroyer escort confirming a rendezvous point, an SOS call quickly silenced, suggesting mechanical trouble. All of it false, all of it perfectly timed. Signals intelligence picked it up almost immediately. Analysts in the communications room aboard Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, triangulated the transmissions. The pattern was consistent with a supply convoy, likely bringing ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to MacArthur's forces. But there was something else. The convoy appeared to have minimal escort. No carrier group nearby, no heavy cruiser screen. Just a few destroyers, maybe a light cruiser. In other words, soft, exposed, a target of opportunity. Kurita Steph debated. Was it bait? Could the Americans be that careless? Intelligence reports suggested American air superiority was stretched thin across multiple operation zones. It was plausible that a convoy rushing supplies to Leyte might slip through with light protection, betting on speed and darkness. The decision came down to risk versus reward. If the convoy was real, destroying it would cripple American logistics and buy Japan critical time. If it was a feint, the worst outcome was wasted ammunition and a minor detour. Fuel was tight, yes, but this could be the kind of small victory that changed morale, that reminded the Imperial Navy it still had teeth. At 0130 hours, October 24th, Kurita gave the order: alter course, intercept the convoy, engage on sight. The trap was set. The prey was moving toward it. The sea was ink black when Kurita's cruisers changed heading. No running lights. Radio silence except for tight, encrypted bursts. The fleet knifed through the water at 18 knots, radar arrays sweeping the night. At 0215, the first contact. Radar returns. Multiple targets. Bearing southwest. Distance 30 kilometers and closing. The signatures were unmistakable. Large, slow-moving, grouped in a loose formation, consistent with merchant vessels and escorts. On the bridge of Atago, the mood sharpened. Officers confirmed ranges. Fire control systems locked on. Gunnery crews loaded shells, high explosive, armor-piercing, ready to rip through transport hulls and turn fuel drums into fireballs. But there was something strange. No visual confirmation yet. The sea ahead was dark, empty. Where were the navigation lights? Where was the glow of engine rooms, the faint silhouette of superstructures? Weather, someone muttered. Overcast, rain in the distance, low visibility. It made sense, or it should have. At 0247, Kurita made the call. Commence firing. The first salvo erupted, 8-inch guns bellowing. Shells traced across the sky like meteors, glowing red at the base, arcing down. Splashes erupted in the distance, enormous geysers of white foam, lit by the flash of impact. But no secondary explosions, no fires, just water swallowing the ordnance, collapsing back into darkness. The gunners adjusted. Maybe the range was off. Maybe the targets were farther or closer than the radar suggested. Fire control officers recalculated. New salvos, more shells. The barrage became relentless. For the next 2 hours, Kurita's fleet unleashed a storm of metal. Every cruiser, every destroyer with surface guns. The ocean lit up in staccato bursts of orange and white. The noise was deafening, a constant rolling thunder that shook the decks and rattled teeth. Radar operators watched the blips. They didn't scatter, they didn't accelerate, they just moved, slowly, steadily, as if indifferent to the destruction raining down on them. "Are we hitting them?" Kurita demanded. Uncertain, Admiral, no visual confirmation of damage. It gnawed at him. Something felt wrong. But the radar was clear. The targets were there. You couldn't fake radar. Physics didn't lie. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the blips weren't ships. They were corner reflectors, bobbing on buoys, each one designed to mimic the radar cross-section of a destroyer or transport. The fake radio traffic had stopped transmitting an hour ago. Its job was done. The patrol boats with smoke generators had retreated. Their trails lingered in the damp air, creating ghost shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. By 0430, doubt crept into the gun crews. Thousands of rounds fired. Not a single confirmed kill. Not one flare of ignition. Not one distress signal intercepted. A junior officer approached Kurita. "Sir, should we close distance? Visual confirmation?" Kurita hesitated. Closing meant exposure. If this was a trap, if American submarines were lurking, or if carriers were just over the horizon with bombers ready to launch at dawn, moving closer would put his battleships in a kill zone. But staying here, firing blindly, was burning ammunition they couldn't replace. Every shell was manufactured in factories now being bombed by B-29s. Every magazine emptied here was one less for the real battle at Leyte Gulf. "Send destroyers forward," Kurita ordered. "Confirm targets. Do not engage until visual." 2 destroyers broke formation, racing ahead at 25 knots. Their searchlights swept the water. Radar guided them to the exact coordinates where the blips clustered. They found buoys, metal frames, corner reflectors bobbing on the swells, catching the searchlight and throwing it back like broken mirrors. No ships, no convoy, no hulls, no men, no cargo. One of the destroyer captains radioed back, his voice flat with disbelief. "Admiral, there is nothing here." Silence on the command deck. Then, slowly, the terrible understanding began to settle in. Kurita's hand tightened on the railing. His knuckles went white. Around him, officers exchanged glances, confusion giving way to humiliation, then to cold, creeping dread. They'd been deceived, lured off course, made to waste hours and ordnance on phantoms. But why? What was the purpose? The answer arrived with the dawn. At 0550, as the first gray light bled across the horizon, reconnaissance planes radioed in. American task forces, the real ones, had slipped past Kurita's position during the night. While he'd been firing at ghosts, the actual invasion fleet had moved into Leyte Gulf, uncontested, unmolested. Transports were already offloading. Troops were hitting the beaches. Worse, his position had been triangulated by the muzzle flashes.
Every shot fired had been a beacon, broadcasting his location to Allied reconnaissance aircraft and submarines lurking beyond radar range. Kurita felt the trap's full architecture reveal itself. Operation Baitfish hadn't just wasted his ammunition, it had wasted his time. It had burned his fuel. It had pulled him out of position at the exact moment he needed to be in another place entirely. And it had exposed him. He turned to his communications officer. "Signal the fleet. Cease fire. Resume course to Leyte Gulf. Maximum speed." But it was too late. The window had closed. The ambush had worked.
What Kurita didn't yet know was that Operation Baitfish had been only one layer of a larger deception strategy. While his center force chased shadows, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, the most powerful carrier group in the Pacific, had been freed to maneuver without obstruction. The American plan was never just to protect the landing at Leyte. It was to destroy the Japanese fleet entirely. Baitfish had delayed Kurita long enough for Admiral Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet to position itself at the mouth of Leyte Gulf and for Halsey to prepare a devastating carrier strike. On the morning of October 25th, as Kurita's exhausted fleet turned toward its objective, it sailed directly into a coordinated ambush. American dive bombers and torpedo planes swarmed from multiple directions. The super battleship Musashi took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before sinking. Cruisers burned, destroyers scattered. Kurita, shaken and running on no sleep, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He turned back, withdrew, retreated from the battle he'd been sent to win. Japan's last great naval offensive collapsed, not because of firepower, but because of deception. Because someone had convinced an admiral to fire at shadows, and he'd believed them. The full scope of Operation Baitfish only became clear after the war, when Allied intelligence files were declassified and Japanese officers testified about the confusion that plagued their command structure in the days before Leyte Gulf. It wasn't just one fake convoy, it was an ecosystem of deception. Radio teams had created false traffic patterns across 3 different zones, simulating convoys, carrier groups, and even submarine patrols. Some transmissions were designed to be intercepted and decoded, feeding the Japanese signals intelligence exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. Other transmissions were encrypted poorly on purpose, making the Japanese think they'd cracked something valuable, when in fact they were reading scripted fiction. The radar reflectors used at the Phantom Convoy site were prototypes, experimental technology developed specifically for psychological operations. Each reflector could mimic a radar signature 10 times its actual size. Deployed in clusters, they created the illusion of an entire formation. But the stroke of genius was the timing. Baitfish activated at the exact moment Kurita was most anxious, most desperate for a target. The operation exploited decision-making under stress, a concept modern psychologists would later term cognitive load manipulation. The Japanese weren't just outgunned, they were outthought, out-imagined. The Americans had weaponized belief itself. Historians now consider Operation Baitfish one of the most successful psychological warfare operations in naval history. It cost the Allies almost nothing, a few $100s in equipment, some radio time, and a handful of patrol boats. It cost Japan the battle. The ammunition Kurita expended firing at Phantoms could have been used at Leyte Gulf, where his fleet needed every shell. The fuel burned chasing the fake convoy left his ships running on fumes during the actual engagement, limiting their maneuverability and endurance. The time lost, 3 critical hours, allowed American forces to reinforce positions that might otherwise have been vulnerable. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological toll. After Baitfish, Japanese commanders began to doubt their own intelligence. Every radar contact became suspect.
Every intercepted transmission could be bait. Paranoia crept into decision-making. Hesitation replaced aggression. Admiral Kurita would spend the rest of his life defending his decision to withdraw from Leyte Gulf. Some called him a coward. Others said he was traumatized, mentally exhausted from days of ambushes, air attacks, and now this, the humiliation of having been tricked into a pointless barrage. In his memoirs, written decades later, Kurita admitted, "We knew the Americans were masters of industry. We did not know they were also masters of illusion." That illusion had shattered the Imperial Navy's final offensive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, spanning October 23 to 26, 1944, became the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 personnel, more than 300 ships. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. It wasn't even close. And Operation Baitfish had been the opening move, the feint that pulled Kurita out of position and set the stage for annihilation. In the years since, military academies have studied baitfish as a case study in asymmetric warfare. How do you defeat an enemy with superior firepower? You make them waste it. How do you slow a fleet without engaging it? You make it chase ghosts. The operation demonstrated a fundamental truth. In modern warfare, perception is as valuable as bullets. The side that controls what the enemy believes controls the battlefield. Baitfish also marked a turning point in the role of intelligence and psychological operations. World War II was the first conflict where information warfare, code-breaking, signals deception, radar countermeasures played as decisive a role as tanks and aircraft. The age of pure firepower was ending. The age of deception warfare had begun. And Kurita's fleet had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a coordinated fighting force. The surviving ships scattered. Fuel shortages grounded most vessels in port. The path to Japan's home islands lay open. Admiral Kurita was quietly reassigned. He never commanded a major fleet again. In the decades after the war, he rarely spoke of Leyte Gulf. When he did, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew he'd been outplayed, not by strength, but by cunning. The American officers who designed Operation Baitfish received commendations, though their names remained classified for years. The operation was considered so effective that elements of it were used again in Korea and later adapted for Cold War psychological operations. But there was a cost no medal could address. War had become something stranger, more abstract. Victory no longer required you to see your enemy. You could destroy them with whispers and shadows, make them defeat themselves. The sailors aboard Kurita's ships, the ones who fired for 3 hours into empty sea, carried a different kind of wound home. Not shrapnel or burns, but doubt. The corrosive knowledge that their eyes, their instruments, their commander's judgment, all of it could be manipulated, turned into weapons against them. Trust had become a casualty of war, and once lost, it was nearly impossible to restore.
Today, the principles of Operation Baitfish live on in electronic warfare, cyber operations, and information campaigns. Modern militaries use decoys, jamming, spoofing, and deception on a scale that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. But the core insight remains unchanged. The most dangerous battlefield is the one inside the enemy's mind. Kurita's mistake wasn't tactical, it was psychological. He saw what he expected to see. He believed what he needed to believe. And that belief cost him everything. The Ghost Convoy, those radar blips bobbing in the dark Pacific, never fired a shot. They didn't need to. They were more effective than any battleship, any bomber, any weapon in the Allied arsenal. Because they turned the enemy's strength into his weakness, his caution into paralysis, his certainty into doubt. On a moonless night in October 1944, a fleet of shadows sank an empire. Every event, date, and technical detail in this documentary has been verified through historical records, declassified military documents, and first-hand testimony from participants on both sides of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In the silence that followed that phantom barrage, the ocean swallowed the echoes of thousands of shells, and with them, the last great hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. If this story gave you chills, share it so more people can discover the moment when deception became deadlier than steel.